Wonderful. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the stream. It's so nice to have you all here. It is my supreme honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. Colin A. Ross. Dr. Colin A. Ross, MD, completed medical school at the University of Alberta and his psychiatry training at the University of Manitoba in Canada. He is a past president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation and the author of over 275 papers and 36 books. He has spoken widely throughout North America and Europe and in China, Malaysia, Australia, and New Zealand. He has been a keynote speaker at many different conferences and has reviewed over 30 different professional journals. Dr. Ross's books cover a wide range of topics. His clinical books focus on trauma and dissociation include Dissociative Identity Disorder, Diagnosis, Clinical Features, and Treatment of Multiple Personality, 2nd edition, 1997, and Structural Dissociation, a proposed modification for the theory, 2013. Dr. Ross has published a series of treatment outcome studies in peer-reviewed journals, which provide evidence for the effectiveness of the trauma model therapy. Many of his papers involve large series of cases with original research data and statistical analysis, including a paper entitled Trauma and Dissociation in China in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Welcome, Dr. Ross. It is my supreme pleasure to welcome you on my channel.
Well, I'll try and supreme you back then.
So we're going to start out with a kind of a complicated question, even though it's so simple, and that question is, what is dissociation? From my understanding, this is a word with many different definitions.
Exactly. And hence, there's lots of confusion. Plus, there's people with bad attitudes and who don't really know what they're talking about. So throw that into the mix. But I say that there's 4 basic meanings of the word dissociation that kind of float around in literature and in the language. And it's important to know which one you're talking about, otherwise there's mass confusion. So the first meaning of dissociation, and there could be a bunch of others, but this is just 4 main ones. The first meaning is just a general English language meaning. Dissociation is the opposite of association. So when things are associated, they're connected, interacting in some sort of relationship. When they're dissociated, they're disconnected, out of relationship, not interacting. So in that sense, just in general, dissociation is the same as disconnection. And anything can be disconnected from anything in the universe. You can be disconnected from your own feelings internally. There's dissociation constants in chemistry. So it's just a general term that can apply to anything and everything in the universe. The second meaning of dissociation is it's a technical term in cognitive psychology. So this is going back at least as far back as 1980, where there's all kinds of experiments, which are kind of interesting, but in a way not that interesting. So, and many, like literally thousands of different experiments, thousands of papers demonstrate dissociation in memory systems. So an example is, and this is just a little tiny example, but it illustrates how the brain operates. So a bunch of college students come in, they're getting course credit, and they memorize a list of words. And the words are homophonic word pairs, which has nothing to do with sexual orientation. Homophonic means sound the same. So that's like R-E-E-D and R-E-A-D. So you'll see read, and then you'll see a bunch of other ones. And then maybe 2 weeks later, you're brought back into the lab and the researcher asks you to write down all the word pairs you can remember. So somebody might remember, say, 9 out of 20 word pairs. So they have amnesia for the other ones, which they actually have seen, which actually happened in objective reality. And so then the memories, who knows where in their brain. What the researchers then do, they'll ask a question like, what's a tall, thin plant that grows in marshes? And you write down the answer. So people who have seen read misspell R-E-E-D as R-E-A-D more frequently than college students who had a list of word pairs, but it didn't include read, read. So it's a tiny little thing, but it illustrates the principle, which is that information actually it took place in the outside world. The information went in their brain, it's stored in their brain, but they can't consciously remember it. But it's affecting what they do and say in a measurable fashion. And then there's a bazillion other experiments along those lines. So that's a disconnection between your conscious memory and what's stored in your brain. So that's like way, 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 way many times over proven thing in cognitive psychology. So the third meaning then is a phenomenological meaning, which doctors like to use big words so they sound smart. So that just
Mhm.
means symptoms, basically. So dissociation is the symptoms of dissociation that are in this measure, these diagnostic criteria, this literature. And that's no different from what is anxiety? Well, anxiety is check, 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 check through the symptoms of anxiety. What is depression? Well, that's the symptoms of depression that are in the literature. So there's nothing mysterious or different about it. It's the same rules as everywhere. So that's just dissociation as a symptom. And then the fourth meaning, and this is the kind of a little bit more interesting part that leads to a lot of controversy and misunderstanding.
Mhm.
And that is, what's the relationship between dissociation and repression? So the false memory people who attack DID and attack dissociation, one of the things they say about it is dissociation is the same as repression. Repression is just some crazy, outdated Freudian theory. Nobody believes that. Scientists don't believe that. And since repression, there's no scientific evidence for it, and we don't even pay attention to Freud anymore. Therefore, the dissociative disorders are totally bogus. So why are they mistaken? Well, what is repression? So dissociation, I just gave some definitions of, none of which equal repression. So back in 1895, Breuer and Freud published a book called Studies on Hysteria. And back then, hysteria didn't mean being hysterical. It meant basically PTSD, psychosomatic symptoms, dissociative symptoms, all related to trauma. And in this book, which is very interesting, easy to read book, they talk about um, double consciousness, it was called back then.
Oh, thank you for the raid, guys. Welcome. We're learning about dissociative identity disorder today. Continue. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Um, so they talked at great length, they had extended case examples of women who came in as adults to treatment. They had symptoms of hysteria, which was not being hysterical. The authors thought that's directly related to sexual abuse in childhood that actually happened. So that was called the seduction theory. So calling it the seduction theory was already downplaying and whitewashing, you know, criminal child sexual abuse because it was just a seduction. But nevertheless, the idea was the sexual abuse pretty much as described, not perfectly accurate, but pretty much happened as described. And it's directly causing the symptoms decades later. That was the theory. And they called that uh, by different terms, but they didn't call it repression. Then in 1897, in a series of letters to this very oddball guy named Wilhelm Fleiss, Freud repudiated the seduction theory. He decided that the abuse never actually happened. It's all false memories. So then, being Freud, he has to come up with some theories. So in order to explain why women, which is it's 99% women at that point, why women come into therapy with false memories of childhood sexual abuse that never actually happened, he developed repression theory to explain that. So repression theory was developed to explain why, in Freud's opinion, there's all these false memories of childhood sexual abuse. So the
Mm.
false memory people who attack Freud and say Freud is just a nutcase. We don't have to pay attention to him because these are all false memories. They don't even realize that they're stating Freudian repression theory. So that's one dumb thing. And then the question is, what's the difference at the level of defense mechanism? What's going on inside your brain? What's the difference between repression and dissociation? And the best, I hope this is not too long an answer, but the best little diagram model is from a guy named Ernest Hilgard. And he talked about horizontal splitting and vertical splitting.
Mhm.
Horizontal splitting is when there's a barrier in your mind. Above is the conscious mind, below is the unconscious mind. And then vertical splitting is there's a vertical barrier in your mind. It's all in your conscious mind. It's just this part of your conscious mind remembers this. That part of your conscious mind equals an alter personality remembers that, but it's not buried in your unconscious. So repression theory, according to Freud, there's two types of repression. There's primal repression. This is an essay around 1915, 1917. Primal repression is when you have some sort of impulse, some urge coming out of your unconscious mind, but your conscious mind's got some sort of conflict or hang up or fear of it, so it represses it back down. So primal repression has nothing to do with what happened in the outside world, nothing to do with memories at all. It's about instincts and urges. Then there's repression proper, according to Freud. That's when information comes into your brain, is pushed down into your unconscious mind across that horizontal barrier,
Mhm.
where it can be mixed up with dreams and fantasies and get all distorted. And then it comes back up into your conscious mind as a false memory of sexual abuse that never happened. So even as a defense mechanism model, depression or repression is pushing things down into the unconscious mind. But the model in dissociation in DID is it's not buried somewhere in this mysterious underground chamber called the unconscious mind. It's held in your conscious mind by an altered personality. So the amnesia barrier is between conscious and conscious. So it's a completely different model. And it's not just, okay, that's theory. It leads to a very different treatment approach. Because in repression theory, you'd have to do 100 years of psychoanalysis and dig down in the unconscious mind and try and sort stuff out and what's real and what's not real, what's fantasy. But in DID or OSDD, which is other specified dissociative disorder, which is kind of 3/4 DID, in that kind of treatment, you're not trying to pull something up from the unconscious mind. You're trying to reduce the amnesia barrier. And from the point of view of the alter personality, this is not a recovered memory. So one thing that the extreme skeptics, hostile people say is there's no evidence for recovered memories. Nobody ever forgets a serious trauma. That's just ridiculous. Therefore, recovered memory therapy is bogus. So they invented this term recovered memory therapy, which was never mentioned in the literature. Nobody ever claimed to be doing recovered memory therapy. So it's a straw man. But they invented this term recovered memory therapy. They said it's based on repression theory. Repression theory is bogus. But actually, if we're talking about DID or partial 3/4 DID, it's not a recovered memory from the point of view of the alter personality. It's only a recovered memory from the point of view of other parts or the host, the out front person. So we don't even call it recovered memory therapy. It's not recovered memory therapy. The whole objection is just based on confusion and lousy scholarship.
Mm. Okay. Okay. Um, can you tell me what causes general dissociation?
Well, that's a list of about 17,000 different things. So there's multiple causes. So one can just be fatigue, right? You kind of zoned out because you're so tired because you didn't get enough sleep last night. You can be dissociated from what happened because you were so drunk you don't remember. You can be dissociated because you just got a concussion and you're kind of out of it and you're not quite back to yourself yet. You can have a brain tumor. So there can be a million different physical causes of dissociation where you're disconnected from your memory, disconnected from your sense of self. You smoked a joint, but it was some kind of really strong hash, and you depersonalized, which is you felt disconnected from yourself, like you weren't quite real, like the outside world's not real, which is derealization is when the outside world seems unreal. Depersonalization was you don't seem real. So that can happen just as a chemical effect of marijuana or hashish, THC, and it wears off after however many hours. So there's a whole pile of different physical causes of dissociation. And then it's commonly is a response to trauma. It can just be a response to general stress. So it's so stressful, you just kind of put the feelings on the back burner. You don't have amnesia for what happened. You've just disconnected from the feelings.
Mhm.
And then that leads us to the body keeps the score. So you may be having body memories equals all these pain sensations, physical sensations. So that's the physical part of the memory that comes back up as a physical sensation. You can have just the emotion part of the memory come up, and then you're all of a sudden anxious, or you're scared, or you're this, or you're that. And it's not connected to what's happening currently or any memory of what happened in the past.
I
So,
experience those quite a bit.
yeah, people with complex dissociative disorders means full DID or partial DID usually. um, and the difference is just a matter of degree. The parts are not quite as distinct. They're not quite as separate. There's not quite as much amnesia. So it's all just a matter of degree. And there's no sharp cutoff between, like, this is 100% DID, this is only 89%, this is 72%, right? It's all on a spectrum or a continuum. um, but in practical terms in therapy, if it's full DID or 3/4 DID, a lot of it is related to childhood trauma. And it's basically, this is too much to feel, too much to know, too much to cope with. Your mind just breaks it into bits and pieces. And then those bits and pieces get reinforced because the abuse doesn't just happen once. And then the parts evolve separate identities and names and ages and different functions. It all just sort of grows. And nobody understands exactly how that works, but it does.
And what causes disordered dissociation?
Uh, well, overall, by and large, in general, the more extreme the trauma, the more long lasting, uh, the more it happens, the more perpetrators, the more complicated the dissociation, which just makes sense. You need more complicated coping strategy to deal with more complicated trauma.
Mhm.
Um, and then it becomes, so what makes it a disorder? So I remember interviewing a woman who's an author of a series of books, actually a very successful business person, and her name is J.Z. Knight. And she's got a not alter personality, this character named Ramtha from, I think it's 40,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years ago. And Ramtha takes over and writes all her books, and she has no conscious memory of doing the writing.
Mm.
So I did a workshop for her at her sort of retreat place years ago, like 20 plus years ago. And she asked me, do you think I have DID? And I said, no, I don't think you have dissociative identity disorder. I think you have dissociative identity order, which is kind of a little joke. But
I like that.
point being, what makes DID a disorder is not simply that there's different parts. It's the conflict, the dysfunction, the symptoms. It interferes with your ability to get life done. You have flashbacks, nightmares, all kinds of PTSD going on, probably depression. So that in ICD-11, which is International Classification of Diseases, which is the World Health Organization, there's complex PTSD, which is a very good concept. which is not in the DSM yet. And it's basically exactly what it says. It's quotes regular PTSD with a whole lot of other stuff, depression, trouble just coping with your feelings, psychosomatic symptoms, relationship problems, self-regulation problems,
Mhm.
drug and alcohol problems. And it's conceptualized as all part of one thing, not a bunch of separate disorders. So I agree with that. So the amount of the complexity of the trauma is pretty correlated with the complexity of this personality system, which then leads to more conflict, more disagreement, more amnesia, more this person wants to go left and this person wants to go right. So it's all the conflict and the dysfunction, the anxiety, the distress that makes it a disorder.
That makes a lot of sense. And honestly, that makes me feel better about my little team because we can be absolutely disordered, but for the most part, we kind of understand that we are in one body and we are working together to have the best life that we can. And so we have to all vote.
And do you all have pink ears and blue hair?
No, just me.
Oh,
Just me.
you're the lucky.
Yeah. I am the
Well,
lucky one. I'm Winnie, by the way. I am an alter that was developed to uh kind of relate more to the world and be more affectionate to the world around us. As in order to seem like everything was okay. I'm one of the apparently normal parts.
yeah, so that's from structural dissociation theory. The two key terms are apparently normal personality, ANP, and emotional personality equals EP. So, and that's I know the authors of that book and that theory, they're really good people, have done tons of good work for the dissociative disorders field, lots of writing, lots of teaching, etc. Um, but I kind of don't like the terms that well, the apparently normal personality,
I
because
don't either. I'm not normal.
no, well, being normal could equal being boring for one thing, but apparently normal sounds like you're kind of faking being normal and you're really abnormal, and it's got a lot of bad connotations. And the emotional personality, so EPs, child adolescent parts, often have tons of emotions, but that makes it sound like they just have silly emotions, or there's something wrong with them because they have emotions, or the adult personality doesn't have any emotions, none of which makes any sense. So I kind of don't like the vocabulary, but the theory applies totally to DID. It's basically a description of DID. And obviously it's very good to have a ANP, somebody who deals with the outside world in regular life, so you can at least function a fair amount of the time reasonably well.
I've got two. I've got me, and then I've got Grammy. That's my wonderful gremlin personality. Dorky, very awkward, does their best, but genuinely not the best in social situations. I'm a little bit better at it.
Well, welcome to teamwork, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's why whenever streaming came up, I was the one that stepped up. I was the one that volunteered. This was it fit my role really well. We do have other representatives with other models that occasionally come on and talk about their experiences, but for the most part, it's just me. And as far as child alters, they will not be coming online to talk about their experiences. We will they are beings to be protected, and we are currently working with our therapist actually on emotional regulation for them. It's a long and complicated journey, but it's been really rewarding.
Good.
Little bit step, little itty bitty rewards.
Well, I often say that somebody just asked me this morning, actually, how long does this take? Um, and I say, well, it's not weeks or months, and it's not 100 years, but I can't really give you a much better estimate, but it's going to be, a multi-year project. Um, but it's doable if you keep at it, you put your mind to it, you work consistently, and there's not, horrible major trauma ongoing every day in your life.
Mhm.
Um, and then I compare it to doing a PhD. Doing a PhD is like a 3 or 4 year project, and it's intellectually complicated. You got to do a lot of reading and a lot of writing. So DID therapy is at least as complicated intellectually as doing a PhD, but it's way tougher emotionally. But if you keep at it, you eventually get your PhD.
I
And
love that analogy.
so then I have to talk about, okay, what kind of work are we talking about here? And the out front person, most of the time, is generally called the host personality, just for a term. Um, then I have to talk about, okay, what's the goal of therapy here? How does this work? And I'm explaining it to the host personality, but I'm actually explaining it to the parts inside, which again, I just did this morning. Uh, First of all, this is not about getting rid of parts. We don't want to get rid of parts because they're all part of the whole. They're all there for a reason. They have skills and memories and talents. And anyway, I don't have a pair of tweezers where I can reach inside your ear and pull the parts out, right?
Mhm.
Even if I wanted to get rid of parts, there's no way for me to do that. You can suppress parts inside temporarily, but the idea is really the opposite of getting rid of. It's building a team, helping everybody get to know each other, get the communication up and the amnesia barriers down, and then all the painful work of processing all of the trauma. And some people just decide when they get to the sort of cooperative, no amnesia functioning team, that's as far as they want to go in the process, which is fine. Some people want to go all the way to full integration, which again is not getting rid of parts. It's a gradual joining together, blending. They get less separate, less distinct. They share more. And even when you're at that stage, nobody can, it's not like a squishing parts in. It's all by choice, it's voluntary. Nobody can make you get integrated. And if you don't want to, you don't, which is fine. So I explain that to kind of help the parts chill out because the host personality sometimes will say, well, I want to get integrated, which really means I want to get rid of the parts so I don't have to deal with all of that.
Mhm.
So then if the therapist says, okay, we're going to get you integrated in the next 3 weeks, no part in its right mind is going to want to participate in that therapy, right?
No.
So then I'll sometimes explain to the host personality, okay, um, well, I've been talking to your parts and we've come up with a treatment plan. We're going to get rid of you and one of your other parts will live the rest of your life for you. How would you like that therapy? No way. Okay, so nobody in the right mind would agree to that therapy. So why do you think your parts don't want to have that kind of therapy? Oh,
Yeah, I remember whenever I first came to the realization that what I had was not spiritual. There were there very well could be spiritual components to it, but at the end of the day, there is a medical explanation for what was going on in my head, and I had to face that.
mhm.
Panic, sheer panic, because I thought that whenever you look at things medically, integration was the only step, and that none of my alters were comfortable with that. They are comfortable with working towards the health of the whole and the health of the individual alters, which health of the whole.
Oh,
um but they are not interested in integration. If it happens naturally through the course of healing and it feels okay, then okay. But otherwise, we're very happy being our little team. And I love my team.
I
That
100% agree. I remember this way back in the 90s. I remember working with somebody who was integrated because her therapist integrated her. And the way she talked about it just was, wait a minute, you were just sitting there while your therapist integrated you? It's like, getting your teeth cleaned or something. You just sit there and the technician does it. And I thought, well, that's a little suspicious. Um, but then she said, yeah, but this is somebody who studied piano like all the way through high school and could play like Brahms or Bach or whatever. Um, but once she got integrated, she couldn't play the piano anymore.
oh,
So of course I went, well, wait a minute.
That's not right.
It's not right, but so all those piano lessons, did they just fall out on the floor and go clunk? They're, what happened is not integration. The part, because there's a main piano playing part, the part that could play the piano just got buried inside somewhere.
Yeah, that's what
And
it sounds like.
yeah, that's what it was. And she goes, oh, you mean I could play the piano again? Totally.
Oh,
So a lot of mental health professionals are like gung ho on integration because it's kind of like, oh, I integrated somebody. Well, first of all, you don't integrate the person, you help the person along their journey, but it only happens because they do it to themselves if they want to. So
that's comforting.
how you think about these things could seem like a bunch of theory, but actually feels very different.
Um, how does one help oneself out of dissociation? I'm taking a few notes. My therapist and I are working on this, but this was a question that was actually asked by my Twitch chat. They wanted to know.
You just listen to a lot of podcasts.
That's how you help yourself out, is learning?
Yeah, it's all learning. So there's not just one answer or just one thing to do, right? So it's like anything. If you have a heavy drinking problem, there's no way you're going to get into recovery until you decide you want to. And then you have to make this really dig down in there for real commitment to doing the work of recovery. So the first step is, which is sort of wrapped into step one in the 12 steps, is you can't get sober until you decide you want to get sober. When you decide you want to get sober for real, now you can get to work on it. And it's the same thing with anything, including DID. You have to decide, maybe I'll stop being in denial. Maybe I'll stop pretending this isn't happening. Maybe I'll shrug my shoulders, or maybe it's not that bad, which it could be not that bad. Some people are able to function pretty well and they don't do the therapy work. But nobody comes to therapy because everything's going fine, right? So
Right.
people come to therapy because there's trouble with the outside world function and a lot of trouble on the inside. So I often say to people, well, this would really be most effective when I was inpatient. I had inpatient programs for like 30 years, which basically the hospital corporation shut them down because they decided they could fill the beds on their own without me. It was just a dumb business decision. Um, so that's a lot of people over a lot of decades. I had three programs, one in LA, one in Michigan, one in Texas.
Mhm.
So when somebody's an inpatient and I'm doing a group or talking to them, I go, well, there must be something that's not working perfectly, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And nobody can go, oh yeah, life has been going perfectly well. I just came in for the food. Like, so it kind of, your denial is pretty well not going to work anymore. So it's a milder version of the same when you come to therapy. So you came for therapy, so there's something not working, something needs to change. Do you want to work on that or not? No, I'll kind of cruise on the way I am, or yeah, I really want to get to work. So that's the step one, the real commitment. And then it's the next stage. So trauma therapy is generally divided into three stages, which is not just like I'm done with one, check. Now I'm in stage two, check. It's all back and forth and up and down and circle around. But basically, the first stage is making a commitment to therapy, accepting a diagnosis, DID, partial DID, which always has PTSD and a bunch of other stuff going along with it.
That was going to be one of my questions, was if having PTSD was the cornerstone to a DID diagnosis.
The cornerstone is the DID because
Okay.
you can have PTSD without DID. Most people with PTSD have a bunch of dissociation going on, but not full separate parts. Except in structural dissociation theory, they require that there be an EP, which is a wounded child with its own separate identity. And then what happens is you get intrusions from the buried wounded child, which is flashbacks, emotions, memories, body memories, all that stuff. and then numb out, shut down again. So it's up, down, up, down, up, down. They say, the authors, which is Ono Vanderhart, Elliot Nanhouse, and Kathy Steele. And Kathy Steele, who lives in Georgia, is still very active, giving workshops and so on. The other two guys live in Europe, in the Netherlands. So they say that all cases of PTSD, there's a fully formed EP. I don't think I quite agree with that. But once you have quite a bit of complex dissociation, your OSDD or DID, yeah, there's always separate structured parts and EPs. So I can kind of quibble about the theory with them. But basically, complex PTSD is, like I said, it's complex PTSD. DID, almost everybody with DID fits the criteria for complex PTSD.
Mm.
So that's because I compare it to like you're in this massive multi-car pileup and you're brought into the ER by ambulance. You don't just have one thing, right? Like, oh, everything's fine, just has a broken ankle. No, your pulse is up, your blood pressure is going out of control, you got all kinds of pain.
Right. You're going into shock.
So there's all kinds of body systems involved. It's the same with psychological trauma. It's not just one thing.
Um,
But
go
go ahead.
ahead. You first.
That means you second, right?
Yep.
Okay, I've got the sequence. Me first, you second. So um, it's always important to bear in mind that DID is not just DID. There's a bunch of depression to work on, anxiety, PTSD, often drug and alcohol problems, all kinds of stuff. That was going to
Uh,
be my right there.
one of the daughter of Cthulhu in my chat asked me a question. Great name, by the way. Do I communicate with my alters, if I understand my statement correctly? The answer is yes. The communication between some alters is better than other alters. For instance, we had a new emergence not that long ago. That's what I call them, is emergences,
Right,
not splits. Sometimes I have a split. I had one whenever I discovered that my father had a fatal condition.
right.
Yeah, there was no stopping that one. Um, but I had an emergence just the other day. My communication with that altar is not super great, which is why currently we have a messaging board system and different things like that. And also today I have therapy, which I'm super excited for. And we're going to get to tell our therapist all about Lavender, which is her name.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
and I'm excited. I've missed going to therapy. This is my first therapy appointment in a while. So can what are steps are taken before diagnosing someone with dissociative identity disorder?
Before that, just quick comment on emergence. So as
Please.
general rule of thumb, when parts emerge, that doesn't mean that they were created 5 seconds before.
Right.
Usually created a long time ago, they just haven't manifested to the out front person yet. But if some big trauma happens, like you described, which doesn't have to be abuse, it could be loss, neglect, who knows what, or you yourself get a serious illness, then you can create a new alter personality in that moment. So that would be a new split. So, but most of the time, when you meet a part, it's already been around for quite a while. You just didn't know that part.
I'm pretty sure Lavender was from the first time we became homeless. I'm pretty sure that was when she split. And considering her levels of anxiety, I'm pretty sure, but I'm also not 100%.
Well, that makes sense. Um, so what do you have to do? So accept that you have a complicated dissociative disorder. It doesn't really matter. Some people get very wrapped up in, do I have full DID? And if the answer is not clear, the answer is not clear. But it doesn't make that much difference because whether it's 75%, 82%, 93% full DID, it's pretty much all the same work anyway. For instance, if you're going to write a letter to your child part, you could not even have a dissociative disorder. It's just a metaphor. You're writing to that child aspect of you and to those unresolved feelings from the trauma that happened when you're a kid with no separate part. But it's going to be more or less the same letter. But if you have actually formed 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 child alters, you're basically going to write the same letter. So a lot of the work is, especially when you're 3/4 of the way out or more, obsessing about the official diagnosis isn't that important. It'll come clear in time. But anyway, it's the same work. That's one of my comments I make commonly. So there's writing to your parts, allowing your parts to write in the journal, drawing a diagram of who the parts are, what you know about them, just to keep track of things. You can do artwork where you communicate back and forth by you do something, part does something. Obviously talking to your therapist. And then you can just practice what's called co-consciousness, which is part A is aware of when part B is out and part B is aware of what part A does, and they can talk on the inside together and et cetera, et cetera. That's co-consciousness. Co-present is when, instead of Winnie's out front driving the car and somebody else is on the inside, and then that person comes out and drives the car and Winnie's on the inside, co-presence is kind of like 2 people in the driver's seat at the same time.
Mm.
Which is a very common thing. And that co-presence can go from 0 all the way to 100, which is a full switch. We're kind of in the middle, or it can be 1/4 of the way or 3/4 of the way. And it can be hard to pin down and track, but you start feeling a little different. You don't feel like you're quite in control of what's going on here, but you're present. So there's no amnesia. So that's all to do with shifting in and out. When you just shift a little bit, you're kind of like a 1/4 co-present. When you shift all the way, then that's a switch. But it's all part of the same process. So it's tracking all of that. And then you can consciously make an effort, and you can practice in therapy. When so-and-so's out front, so-and-so's awake and listening inside. Then so-and-so on the inside goes, hey, I'm here, and says something. Then the out front person tells the therapist. Then the therapist goes, oh, okay. Anything else you'd like to tell me? That's called talking through to the parts. So talking through to the parts is just practicing the journey towards co-consciousness.
I remember doing that quite a bit with my therapist, especially when it comes to my parts that are really shy, like my littles that hold a lot of trauma. They can be very iffy about being in the front at all, and if they are in the front, then it's deeply uncomfortable for them
Right.
because I think the physical sensations of the trauma that they've experienced come with them into the front and we just start like seizing up.
Yeah.
Um it's this conversation is very validating, by the way, thank you, because a lot of the time someone will ask me who's fronting and I'll go, I don't know. It's me and somebody.
And that's actually common. I mean, so it's always, there's, like I've been saying, it's all on a spectrum, right?
Mhm.
Everything tends to be on a spectrum. So there can just be, this part is out front, 100%, no question, no confusion. But if you're kind of in halfway in the shift there, it could just be unclear. And that's
And
a common thing in DID.
and I experience that nearly every day. So that it just knowing that that's normal is really nice.
Do you know who, there's a famous American philosopher who's really big in the back in the 70s and 80s, really. He had red hair and freckles. His name was Alfred E. Newman.
Oh,
Do you know who that is?
I think I do actually. I think I named a puppet after him.
Well, he's the guy on the cover of Mad Magazine, which was very big in the 60s, 70s back then. So the reason I mention him is his motto was, what, me worry? I think that's a great motto.
That is
So,
a great motto.
and I think it applies to DID. So the opposite is catastrophizing, which is, oh my God, the end of the world. chilling out and just like, it's not that big a deal. It's okay. This whole DID thing is a little weird, but it's pretty normal on the other hand. That by itself can be pretty helpful. And so then
Uh,
that leads to the cognitive therapy part of it, which is changing the self-talk, dialoguing with yourself, and you become the therapist for your parts.
we have an alter that is almost like a, I don't want to call her a mom, but she is very much like a caregiver in a
Mhm.
way, and she is very good at the internal therapy. She's very good at it.
Well, I'm just going to bug you a bit here for a second. So
Oh, please.
why do you not want to call her a mom?
Uh, because mom, well, I guess she is kind of a mom to our littles.
So obviously people with the idea of commonly had not good experiences with moms, dads, brothers, uncles, and so on. But a good mom is a good thing.
And she is pretty great, so I guess I could call her system mom. That's Sophie, by the way, everybody.
Sophie.
Yeah, Sophie, she's wonderful.
Sorry, I forgot your name. Your name is Winner,
Winnie,
not Winner.
not winner, although I am a winner.
Ah, just a little dumb joke by Dr. Ross.
Can you briefly talk about some documentaries that you've helped make on the subject of DID?
Well, there's ones that I've participated in but didn't help make at all. Uh, like there's one that's on Netflix currently called The Monster Inside,
Mhm.
um, which is about a guy who was a serial rapist who had DID, and it's a whole story, a real life story from uh,
Oh,
most
real quick, that brings me to one of my other questions. I do not mean to interrupt you.
yeah,
People with DID, are they more or less likely to hurt people than the general population? I know the answer to this, but I want to ask this. This is a from a doctor point of view.
okay. So mental illness just in general. So we see like when there's a mass shooting, of which there's way too many, then some politicians and some people will say, yeah, we got to get tough on crime and we got to do this and we got to do that. And we got to lock up all the crazies and we have to screen people for schizophrenia and because only crazy people do this stuff. That's an attitude, not a fact. The facts are that this is mostly like schizophrenia, bipolar, those, those heavy duty kind of
Mhm.
psychiatric disorders. There's lots of data, and this is the official position of the American Psychiatric Association, not just my opinion. The rate of violence towards other people is either exactly the same as the rate in the general population or only slightly higher. But when you statistically account for substance abuse, most of that's coming from substance abuse, not from the mental illness. So when like
Mm.
statistically take out the part that's due to substance abuse, then there's no difference at all. What people with severe mental disorders of all kinds are at risk for is not hurting others, it's being hurt themselves. And as we know in DID, often the anger gets turned inward on yourself. So hurting yourself is a common thing emotionally, cutting, other things. But actually, people with DID, except in Hollywood, are not more dangerous than people in general.
Perfect. Now, please continue what you were saying about the documentary that's on Netflix.
Okay. Well, it's an example of somebody who had DID and who was very dangerous,
Mhm.
uh, who actually, in fact, committed at least 3 rapes of college students, got caught, um, and then he ended up this is a whole other topic is not guilty by reason of insanity. So he pled not guilty by reason of insanity, and his lawyer won, and so he was found not guilty of these rapes. But then the sort of justice in a backhand kind of way, he actually spent more time locked up in mental hospitals than he would have served in a prison if he just pled guilty. So he
Mm.
worked, but it backfired. And I personally I don't believe in the insanity defense just as a concept. Like, why are you not guilty of robbing the bank, depending on how you were feeling at the time or your mental state? To me, guilty should just be about the facts of what happened. So it shouldn't hinge on your mental state. Like,
I'm gonna have to agree. Mostly, system responsibility is a thing too. If I went out and robbed a bank, then that means that there is a part of me deep down, even if I had no memory of doing that action, that was capable of that. And therefore, I have to take responsibility for it.
so some people are going to take the opposite view. Well, I can't be held responsible for what my parts did. I don't even remember. The problem, so there's the legal system and then there's therapy. So in the legal system, I just think it doesn't make sense as a concept for mental disorders in general, because guilt should just be, did you do it or not? Then if I was in charge of the legal system, I would say no psychiatric mental health testimony at all until we find out is the person guilty or not. If they're not guilty, what do you need a psychiatrist for? Uh, if they are guilty, then there could be a second phase where mental health testimony comes in to discuss, okay, not the length of the sentence, but what kind of services do they need while they're imprisoned? Which sounds great, but in fact, in reality, you're not going to get DID therapy in prison no matter what.
Right.
But in theory, that's the way I would like to see it set up. And,
In
but on,
theory, that would be wonderful.
yeah, well, welcome to theory. But then on the other hand, like, this is just a made up scenario. So the guy comes into the 7-Eleven with a big gun and he says, hand over 5 chocolate bars. And then the very scared attendant there hands over 5 chocolate bars. The guy sits down and starts eating the chocolate bars, puts his gun down and says, hey, and call the police. I need to talk to them. The police come in and arrest the guy. And he's like psychotic, delusional, doesn't know what's going on. Well, that guy's not like a typical criminal, right?
Right.
But you can't just walk in and rob stores at gunpoint. So yeah, I can see why people would say he needs to not be guilty of a crime because it wasn't even a crime. Oh, well, he 5 chocolate bars, come on. So I can kind of see the counter argument. Would the
Hmm.
solution would be, okay, so this is what he did. How long should he spend in jail? And what kind of services? It's all theory because he's not going to get those services anyway. So that's on the legal system side of it. In therapy, we're talking about being responsible for what your parts do now. So it's emotionally, it's very easy to understand. Oh, why do I have to be held responsible for what my parts did?
Hmm.
Not hard to understand. But if you go, oh, okay, sorry, you have DID, you're not responsible for what you do. What actually happens is you get more irresponsible behavior because it
Yeah.
gives the person a license to go, I can't help it. And then the horrible parts go and do such and such. The host personality gets the benefit, which is, oh, I shoplifted a sweater. I get to wear a nice sweater, but it's not my fault. Uh, so it it goes the opposite direction of therapy and recovery. And it just results in you've got a license to do all kinds of unhealthy behaviors to the outside world, but also to yourself. Whereas if you're kind of held to a higher standard, then people just naturally gravitate up to where the bar is set, right? So the bar is set higher. Okay. So it seems kind of mean and cold-hearted and unfair, but it actually, I think, is very important to therapy.
I think so too. System accountability, it may not seem or feel fair, but it absolutely is. For instance, I have a partner, and at one point, one of my alters was very angry at the partner, and they were not vocalizing their anger in a healthy manner. And we all had to take responsibility for her actions afterwards because that came out of us, and inevitably we hurt that person. Like everything ended up being okay, but that didn't mean that that person wasn't hurt by our actions.
Exactly. Which is, okay, so that's DID, but welcome to human life, right? How often do people get angry and say hateful things to their partners? So it's
Hmm.
not just DID people. But the non-DID person could have a cop out too. Well, I was just in a bad mood. Or, well, why are you making such a big deal out of it?
Yeah, I suppose, but
So that would be non-DID, not taking responsibility for your own actions. So
I understand.
not taking responsibility for your own actions is not unique to DID.
Um, can you explain inter-system relationships and roles?
Um, the answer is always yes and no, right? Because
Yes.
like I'm an expert on DID, but I always say to somebody that I'm talking to or working with, okay, I'm the outside expert here. You know, I've talked to lots of people and been to conferences and so on, but you're the expert on what's going on inside you. I don't know all your parts. I've just met you. So how about if the outside expert and the inside expert work together to help figure things out? I can't just be the expert and I tell you do this and do this and do this. And it's not a bossing around kind of approach. It's I take the position of, well, I'm going to be part of your recovery team. I'm the outside team member.
I love
So,
that you call it that because I call mine my mental health team. That's so nice.
and that's actually a common phrase in the field, the mental health team. But a lot problem in psychiatry, I could go on for an hour about problems in psychiatry, but one is the vocabulary is managing the difficult case. So it's like the psychiatrist manages the patient. I just don't like that way of talking because what I'm supposed to walk around behind you 24 hours a day managing you. I'm the consultant is helping you learn to manage yourself. So the team is a good concept, but in reality, it can often be the team's bossing you around and locking you up and forcing you to take meds and so on, which sometimes is necessary, but it's not really a team.
Actually, I had on my channel not that long ago a Mr. Gabe Howard who he talked about his experience being locked away in a mental institution and being diagnosed with bipolar disorder and the stigma surrounding that. And that was a really enlightening discussion. It is sad that sometimes that has to be the case, but in the end, I think it helped him. He seemed so much happier now than he was back then.
Well, it often is helpful, but there's maybe it's like 10-ish years old now. Anyways, a study in Australia, which was one of a series of studies, um, that I can't remember the exact numbers, but this is all people with schizophrenia. Something like 50 to 70% had full PTSD from trauma inflicted on them inside mental hospitals. So all these takedowns and lockdowns and threats,
Mm,
and that can cause full PTSD. So the system often is making people worse, maybe helping a little bit. Um, but I don't want to spend all my time on the anti-psychiatry kick since I'm a psychiatrist. Uh, but a true team, mental health team on the outside, true team on the inside, that's definitely the way to go.
I agree. And between my chosen family, my therapist, my psychologist, who is wonderful, love her. 10 out of shout out to you. I'm hesitant to name you because online, but shout out to you, psychiatrist of wonderfulness. Um, and this we're starting to get to the end of the interview, so I want to get to one of the questions. Do you have any tips regarding PTSD and sleep? I have several friends and several family members who struggle with this. So, and I know for a fact that there's a couple of them watching. Hi, I love you guys.
Um,
Hi, mom.
that's chosen mom you're talking about, right?
No, actually, that was just a joke. There's no other figure out there.
Yeah. Um, well, that's a complicated problem. So there's basically medication and psychological stuff, right? So there's just basic, it's called sleep hygiene. So it's probably not a good idea to have 3 Red Bulls half an hour before bedtime, right?
Right.
So you want to keep the caffeine consumption down as much as possible and probably caffeinated coffee in the morning, but maybe lunchtime, but not after that. You don't want to be in some like hyper arousing game right up to 2 minutes before bedtime. You don't want to watch like a scary horror movie just before bedtime. Uh, you might want to, whatever works for you, like a glass of warm milk or anything that's soothing, calming. Do some meditation, do a little bit of yoga, do some self-talk, whatever it is that's relaxing. Speaking of lavender, if you have soothing scents, have some soothing scents, whether it's incense or whether it's a candle, smelly candle, anything that's like, oh, then work on your self-talk. Okay, wait a minute. What am I really catastrophizing about? What am I telling myself is the disaster that's going to happen? Um, and then there's the trauma part of it, because pretty commonly bad stuff would happen in the evening or after bedtime, right? So then going to bed is like glued onto trauma. Abuse is going to happen. So then it'll be talking to your parts, orienting parts of the present, which is a whole project. It's 2024 now. We're not living back then. We're safe. Perpetrator's not going to come. Building a safe place inside for the littles to have a nice bed, nice pillows, maybe an inside caretaker to read them a book so they can go to sleep before the body goes to sleep, which then makes it a lot easier for the body to go to sleep.
That's an interesting thing to talk to touch on, because just last night I was like, I'm pretty sure some of my alters are asleep, but I'm awake.
Well, that's good. So you don't want traumatized alters awake and having flashbacks while you're trying to go to sleep.
Oh, that's such a
So
good point.
none of these things is the complete solution to everything, right? It's a try this, this, and this, and this. And I always say the more tools in the toolbox, the better. On the medication side of things, so if you have a drinking problem, I'm not going to recommend you have a glass of wine in the evening. But if you don't have a drinking problem and you do like wine, a glass of wine could just help you like relax, chill out a little bit, or listening to soothing music, anything that helps calm you down. Um, then wine now takes us into medication. So there's a variety of different medications which are sedating. For instance, Seroquel, which is actually an antipsychotic medication, which can cause weight gain and side effects and so on. But if you just use it a little, relatively small doses at bedtime, not for years on end, you're not going to gain like 100 pounds and you're not going to develop tardive dyskinesia and all these other side effects. So it can be very sedating and very helpful. Trazodone, which is an antidepressant, typical 50 milligram dosage, which is low for trying to use it as an antidepressant. Quite sedating, helps a lot of people. Some people get weird dreams from it. Melatonin is very useful. It's over the counter, it's natural. Sometimes you have to kind of crank the dose up. Typical would be 3 milligrams, increase it to 6, sometimes up to 10. I've met people who use 20 milligrams at bed. Because if you imagine, like your nervous system's like this, it can take a lot of counter push to get it back down to here so it can go to sleep, right?
Right. Isn't overusage of melatonin dangerous?
Uh, it's not as dangerous as overuse of fentanyl.
That's fair.
So overuse of any medication is not, except for like very short little bursts. Like you're not going to destroy your liver by using melatonin in a high dose for a week or something.
Right.
Um, but it's by and large, it's kind of safer and less toxic than a lot of medications.
Okay.
And then there's the benzodiazepines, which is Ativan, Xanax, Valium, all those ones. They can be big help for daytime anxiety, big help for sleep. Problem is, some people abuse them. If you take large amounts for a long time, you can get addicted, physically addicted, and you got to taper down. It's a big problem. But a lot of people take those medications, same dose responsibly for years. They don't abuse it. They don't develop tolerance, equals needing more and more and more. And when it comes time to taper down, as long as you do it fairly slowly, it's quite doable often. So there's a bunch of medications basically.
Okay, perfect. Okay. My closing questions. Do you have any tips, or do you have anything to say, or any tips for those watching who think they might have dissociative identity disorder or OSDD?
Um, yeah, yes, there, I have a series of tips. So one is just like write down, well, why do you think that? Like do some journaling about it. What are the symptoms? Where do I think it came from? What do I know about it? And then go online and get some education about it from all kinds of sources, including this. And then next step is go see a mental health professional. But the problem is most mental health professionals are pretty out to lunch about dissociation. It's not taught in schools. There's a lot of hostile professors, like psychology professors, who poo-poo it and say it's rare and probably just made up and it's just an excuse for bad behavior, all that kind of stuff. The International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation has a website. I belong to that. I'm a past president of it. So the website is ISST-D.org.
Okay, I can link that in my YouTube description too.
And when you go there, then there's all kinds of information there. And they have mostly professional training, but anybody can take the courses. And they have, like on the sort of upper right quarter of the screen, you'll see find a therapist. Click on find a therapist, and then you can type in where you live, like the city and the state. And then you can search by 25 miles or within 100 miles. And there'll be a list of therapists who all belong to the ISSTD because they're interested. And then you just call them, see if they have openings. If they don't have openings, do they know who does? And get an assessment.
Okay,
And the
perfect.
assessment may be, it's not likely to be definitely not, but it may be not sure, it's going to take longer to figure this out. And then the question is, do you want to start therapy with that person and figure it out as you go along?
I remember going in to see my psychologist for the first time and mentioning DID. And at first, my psychologist was like, in a very reassuring manner, I've never met anybody who's ever had DID. Like anyone who's come in and who has like with concerns or has had symptoms, we've gone over it and it's been something else instead. But that same psychologist, whenever I had a switch in her office for the first time, she started talking about medications, and my protector switched in because we're putting substances in our body now. It's his time. It's his time to shine to make sure that we're safe. She noticed immediately, and she asked, "Who am I speaking to?" And it was scary and validating and amazing. The professionals know what they're talking about, folks.
Some professionals do.
That's true. That's true. And this is something else that I'm really glad we're talking about. Finding a mental health professional that works for you can be not, you may go to one, you may go to two, you may go to three, and it may not work and it may not fit. And that's okay.
And keep counting past 3 sometimes.
Yes.
So, but you're going
You,
to increase the odds if you go to somebody who's listed on this website. Because
perfect. And
they're at
will
least
you,
open, receptive, and reasonably knowledgeable about it.
will you
They may
email me
be
at
a
the
brand
website?
new therapist, they may be a beginner, but at least they've got the open mind and the open attitude.
Would you mind emailing me the website?
Well, there's a $2,000 fee for that payable.
Oh dear. Oh no. Hey, if you would like to sub to the channel, now is the time.
Yeah, I can email that to you.
Perfect, thank you. Do alters always know their own name? Okay, we only have a couple minutes, but I can actually answer this question from my personal experience, and that is no. Sometimes my alters had to find a name that fit them. And then I had one or two alters, actually two, that came with their names that just seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The brain was just like, they are named. And the rest of them had to pick.
Yeah, it's very variable like that. And there's no rule that says you have to have a name or you can't have a name or you have to have an age or and there's some people who like if their name is Susan, there's 5 Susans of different ages, but they all have the name Susan, which can get a little confusing and hard to keep track of.
Mhm.
Um, it's all different combinations. And then sometimes parts don't want a name. Sometimes they don't want to tell you their name because that'll give you power and control to manipulate and hurt them, they think. Um, and so if somebody wants to have a name, that's fine. And then I'll sometimes, like if somebody's got a part and the name of the part is mean, ugly person, then after I get to know mean, ugly person a bit, I probably will go, how do you like being called mean, ugly person? It's not a good way to make friends. What would you be interested in having a different name? And parts will sometimes choose a different name.
That's actually exactly what happened with Lavender. Whenever she first came forward, whenever we asked her what she would like to be called, it was really funny. We asked her, what would you like to be called? And her first response was terror, because it's what I feel. And we were like, okay, that does make you sound just a bit like a warlord, but okay.
Well, another thing is I sometimes say, because there's this huge scary monster part inside. Uh, how old do you think you were when that part was created? I don't know for sure, but around 6 or 7. Okay. So that part was created. It wasn't made out of brick or stone or wood. That part was made out of the mind of a scared, terrified child. So often inside the scary costume, there's a scared child. But if I'm tough and big and scary, nobody can hurt me. So often the scary persona is just a protective outfit, so to speak.
And that brings me to one of my favorite sayings. One of my favorite content creators says this, and I've adapted it, the Gianu system on Instagram for anyone who wants to look them up. And they say that a lot of the times persecutors are just protectors with maladaptive coping skills. And I really, really genuinely believe that, especially after my own personal experience with my own persecutor, who is now a protector of fun.
And that's from a professional point of view, that's big majority of the time the case. And often they were not persecutor parts up until age 10, 12, 13, 15. And then they kind of morphed into that role.
Hmm, that's
The
so interesting.
important thing there is, okay, so your core identity is actually protector. And you're trying to protect the system, but maybe we need to tweak your methods a little bit.
Hmm.
So we're not trying to change the part's core identity. It's just tweaking the strategies a bit.
And we didn't change Damon. He's still chaotic. He can still get us into trouble, but he's also the one that makes sure that we're not just a stick in the mud all the time.
Exactly.
Okay. Do you have any advice for those watching who think they might have post-traumatic stress disorder?
It's the same thing. Read up about it online. There's self-help books about PTSD because PTSD is way more accepted in mainstream. See what kind of educational videos and webinars and so on you can find online, and then talk to a mental health professional about it. And search by somebody who works with PTSD and trauma. It's kind of a buzzword now to be trauma informed. So all kinds of therapists and programs claim to be trauma informed, which sometimes is really, really true and sometimes is just bogus marketing.
Mhm.
Have to be careful for that.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ross, for agreeing to come on my channel. I have learned so much. I feel very validated and very, I don't know, just you are a very invigorating person to have a conversation with. I hope to have more conversations with you.
That'd be fun.
It would. You take great care of yourself, and everybody who's watching, please remember to stay hydrated and take breaks. It is so important. You got to take care of yourself. Keep that meat suit running. I believe in you. Thank you guys so much for stopping by. I look forward to next time. We're going to be interviewing next Friday Dr. Bethany Brand, and I am so very, very excited.
She's fantastic and really good researcher.
I am so excited to meet her. She's another person who I really admire. I'm so nervous. Which, by the way, I was so nervous for you.
Well, hopefully I didn't totally terrify all the child.
No, actually, with honestly, your jokes put me at ease pretty quickly.
One of my mottos is, by the way, when the going gets tough, the kids get going.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense, especially for DID.
Yeah, because often the adult part is like, I'm out here, throws a child part out, which can be very disarming and distracting because the child part is cute and not overwhelmed with trauma. It's a great avoidance strategy for the adult.
That has happened.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Oh God. Okay. Everybody, remember, take good care of yourselves. Bye.
I
1, 2, 3.